Ashford Lux Hotel, London. A chilly November evening, yet inside the grand ballroom of the Ashford Lux Hotel, the atmosphere was the complete opposite. Warm, vibrant, and filled with an indescribable excitement. A crowd of journalists, investors, business moguls, and elite guests had gathered to attend the annual press conference of Ashford Lux, the prestigious luxury hotel chain led by Dylan Ashford. At the center stage, a row of microphones was set up, ready for the head of the corporation to speak. Spotlights shimmered, reflecting the opulence in every corner of the venue. Tables draped in pristine white silk, glasses of champagne glistening, and dazzling evening gowns created a perfect picture of grandeur. However, amidst the crowd, one figure stood out in a very distinct way. Blakely Street. Claire. She was not clad in the modest black dresses typically worn by female journalists, nor did she attempt to blend into the background. Instead, she had chosen a striking red dress, elegantly hugging her curves without being ostentatious. Her chestnut brown hair fell in soft waves, her blue eyes twinkled mischievously, and her lips curved into a knowing smile. Blakely Street Claire was not an ordinary journalist. She did not write dull articles like "Successful Businessman Shares Secrets to Success." No, her expertise lay in uncovering the truth, exposing the elite's schemes, and delivering the most captivating stories about them. The powerful figures of society could put on their cold, untouchable facades in public, but she always found a way to see their true selves. And tonight, her target was Dylan Ashford. Dylan Ashford, CEO of Ashford Lux, stepped onto the stage with a composed, charismatic demeanor. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black Tom Ford suit, not a single crease in sight. Every step he took exuded the presence of a man accustomed to power, a man who refused to be controlled. Dylan despised the press. He was well aware of how articles could distort the truth, turning an insignificant matter into a scandal. But this press conference was necessary. He had to maintain his impeccable image and protect the Ashford Lux brand. However, as he stepped off the stage and began engaging with the gathered journalists, one particular gaze caught his attention. Blakely Street Claire. He recognized her instantly, an infamous journalist known for her razor-sharp articles that made even the most powerful elites wary. But she was different from the others. No rush, no hesitation. She took a slow sip of champagne, her eyes gleaming with amusement, before confidently making her way toward him. The first exchange. Dylan had just finished delivering a mundane response to an economic journalist when suddenly a voice, light yet filled with hidden meaning, spoke from beside him. "You hate the press, so why hold a press conference?" He turned to face Blakely. She stood there, her smile subtle, her eyes glinting with playful provocation. Unlike the other reporters, she did not hide her intent to tease him, nor did she show deference to his power. Dylan raised an eyebrow but remained perfectly composed. His voice was deep and steady. "I don't hate the press, I only hate inaccurate reporting." Blakely took another sip of champagne, her lips curling upward. "Oh, well, that's fortunate because I don't write those kinds of stories. I only write the truth." Dylan paused. Not because her words irritated him, but because she spoke with absolute confidence, as if daring him to challenge her statement. Finally, he leaned against the table slightly, and for the first time that evening, allowed himself a rare smile. Not one meant for the public, but one just for her. "I look forward to seeing what you write about me." When curiosity turns into a silent battle, Dylan was not the kind of man who wavered easily. He was used to being surrounded by beautiful women, accustomed to the cunning questions of the press, and familiar with the scrutiny of public opinion. But for the first time, he felt like a woman had read him in just a few exchanges. Blakely felt the same. She had encountered many powerful businessmen, men who either tried to charm her into manipulation or avoided her as if she were the plague. But Dylan Ashford was different. He neither shied away nor exuded arrogance. Instead, he responded with composure, intelligence, and a hint of challenge. The press conference continued, but for both of them, the real game had just begun. Blakely felt an unusual thrill. Perhaps Dylan Ashford wasn't just another dull billionaire, as she had assumed. And Dylan? He had seen thousands of beautiful women, but never anyone like Blakely Street. Claire, a woman who was sharp, charming, and utterly fearless in the face of power. People like them often had a tendency to drag each other into trouble. But who cared? Because at that moment, Dylan knew only one thing. He wanted to know more about her. Ashford Lux Hotel rooftop. The luxury bar? The press conference had ended, yet Blakely lingered at the bar. She had no intention of drinking much, just a glass to unwind after an evening of mental sparring with Dylan Ashford. But when she noticed he was still there, sitting a few seats away, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gray-blue eyes glinting with amusement as he looked at her, things started to take an unexpected turn. "Do journalists not have working hours?" Dylan asked, raising his glass, his voice deep and laced with mockery. Blakely tossed her hair and shrugged. "And what about CEOs? Shouldn't you be in your office, checking your hotel's revenue by now?" Dylan laughed. A real laugh, not the polite, calculated one that reporters often captured. That alone made Blakely feel slightly intrigued. He wasn't irritated by her teasing. If anything, he seemed to enjoy it. 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks. The conversation shifted from the hospitality industry to the elite society, the wealthy who loved to flaunt their riches, and the meaningless luxury items they surrounded themselves with. Blakely casually criticized those who owned countless identical suits just for the sake of stylistic consistency. "Seriously, does anyone actually need 6 identical suits?" She raised an eyebrow, leaning on the bar with a teasing tone. Dylan took a slow sip of whiskey, tilting his head slightly as he looked at her. "Absolutely, because I like perfection." "Perfection to the point of being boring?" Dylan laughed again. No one had ever called him boring, but it seemed like Blakely Street Claire enjoyed provoking him in ways no one else dared to. By the time the 5th cocktail appeared before Blakely, things began to blur. She remembered laughter echoing in the air, remembered Dylan's gray-blue eyes locked onto hers, remembered saying something about how he was too full of himself, and then a hazy mist took over. They had spent the night together. Welcome to today's story. How did you feel about the story you just experienced? Share your thoughts with us. We hope each story brings you meaningful and heartwarming moments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to become part of the Soul Stories family, where we tell tales that touch emotions and hearts. Our stories may not always reflect real life, but they are written with dedication to bring you engaging moments, inspiration, and a fresh perspective for your soul. Stay tuned and continue this journey with us. If you have any feedback or requests, don't hesitate to leave a comment. We always listen and cherish every word you share. Wishing you lots of luck and happiness. In the presidential suite, the morning after, a sliver of light slipped through the luxurious curtains, landing directly on Blakely's face. She groaned softly, turned over, and immediately sensed that something was very, very wrong. The bed was too soft, not hers. A faint scent lingered in the air, sandalwood mixed with something undeniably masculine and alluring. Blakely's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the light. And then, oh my God, Dylan Ashford, Billionaire CEO, the man she had exposed last night, lying right next to her. Worse, he was wearing nothing but a thin sheet draped across his waist. Blakely froze for a few seconds. Her head throbbed like a drum, but her brain worked just fast enough to process the extremely precarious situation she was in. Her eyes darted around the room. A red dress on the floor, high heels abandoned near the door, a tie wrapped around the armrest of a chair. Dear God. Fragments of the night before surfaced, his fingers gripping her waist. A scorching kiss. Low laughter brushing against her ear. And then Blakely squeezed her eyes shut, trying not to panic. "Shit," she muttered, staring up at the ceiling. She wasn't the kind of woman who freaked out over a one-night stand, but she also wasn't the type to get entangled with an arrogant, ridiculously wealthy CEO who could make her life infinitely more complicated if he wanted to. She turned her head slightly, glancing at Dylan, who was still sound asleep. He looked annoyingly at ease. This could not go on for another second. The plan: get dressed, fast, leave before he wakes up. Pretend this never happened. Blakely grabbed her dress, slipping into it while scanning the room for her purse. Once she was ready, she hesitated for a second before snatching a piece of paper from the desk and scribbling a quick note. Thanks for a fun night. No flowery words, no lingering ties. She placed the note down, smoothed her hair, and tiptoed to the door. Dylan Ashford hated mornings. They always arrived too early, too bright, and usually dragged in tedious board meetings. But today, something was worse than the morning itself. She was gone. He groggily opened his eyes, his head still heavy from last night's whiskey. Turning over, he expected to find warm, tangled sheets and the presence of the woman who had stirred his curiosity far more than he wanted to admit. Instead, all that remained was the cold emptiness of the bed and a small note resting on the pillow. Dylan propped himself up on one elbow, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he picked up the note. Thanks for a fun night. 8 words short, dismissive. She had actually left before he woke up? Dylan leaned back against the headboard, one hand resting on his forehead, the other holding the note, his gaze fixed on those few casual words. For the first time in his life, he was the one being left behind. Not that he had expected anything profound to come from last night, but Dylan was used to being the one who dictated how things ended. Women never walked away first, and yet she had disappeared as if last night had meant absolutely nothing. A smirk tugged at his lips, a mixture of amusement and irritation flickering in his stormy gaze. Blakely Street? Claire? Do you really think you can walk away that easily? Dylan didn't like being treated as just another fleeting encounter. He didn't like this feeling, like he'd lost a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. And that only made him want to see her again even more. London Times newsroom, a few hours later. Blakely walked into the office with a large cup of coffee in hand, her head pounding like a drum. Please, no one talk to me this morning, she warned, heading straight for her desk. But before she could even sit down, her close colleague, Sophie, peeked over from the next desk, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. You disappeared after the press conference last night. Don't tell me you... No! Blakely cut her off immediately. Don't ask. Nothing happened. Sophie crossed her arms, tilting her head as she scrutinized Blakely. Really? Absolutely, Blakely nodded firmly. Nothing worth mentioning. Sophie raised an eyebrow, giving her a once-over before lowering her voice. Then why do you have the "I just slept with a billionaire" look on your face? Blakely nearly choked on her coffee. What? Oh, come on, Blake. Everyone knows Dylan Ashford is dangerously attractive. And you? You're a sharp, intelligent, and undeniably captivating journalist. The two of you facing off in a dramatic press conference, then just so happening to drink together afterward? Sophie whistled. I could write an entire novel about this. Shut up. Blakely shot her a glare, but her cheeks felt suspiciously warm. She tried to focus on her computer screen, but for some reason Dylan's image kept flashing through her mind. Those deep gray eyes, that half smirk laced with challenge, that deep voice whispering against her ear last night. Number Blakely shook her head, reminding herself it was just a drunken night. Nothing more. She would never see Dylan Ashford again. What she didn't know was, Dylan Ashford had other plans. The next night, London's winter chill. Blakely unlocked her car, sinking into the driver's seat with a deep sigh as the London night settled over the city. She had just wrapped up a long workday, enjoyed a quiet evening at her favorite cafe, and even made a stop at the grocery store for some croissants for breakfast. She was savoring this moment of peace until her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A name flashed on the screen. Dylan Ashford. Blakely hesitated for a second, considering ignoring it. Then, with deliberate nonchalance, she answered, her voice indifferent, as if this call meant nothing. What do you want? On the other end, Dylan's voice was low, measured, yet every word felt like it carried something more. I'm outside your place. She arched a brow, glancing at the city lights around her, then replied flatly, Too bad, I'm not home. Silence, a brief pause, just long enough to make her feel slightly unsettled. Then Dylan spoke again. When will you be? Blakely tapped her nail against the steering wheel, debating whether to toy with him a little. In the end, she decided to be honest. Not sure. Then I'll wait. There was no hesitation in his voice. Blakely frowned. She had met all kinds of men, those who thought they were the center of the universe and those so dull she could barely remember their names. But Dylan didn't fit into either category. He was Dylan Ashford, a powerful CEO who never had to wait for anyone. And yet here he was, standing outside her home in the middle of a London winter. She didn't know what he wanted, and frankly, she didn't care. If he wanted to wait, let him. So she spent another hour at the cafe, leisurely sipping tea, scrolling through her phone, reading the news, acting as if the phone call had never happened. Then she took an extra lap around the grocery store, lingering in the bakery aisle for 10 minutes just to decide whether to buy an extra box of macarons. By 10 p.m., she finally headed home. She expected Dylan to be gone, but he wasn't. He was still there. Leaning casually against the wall beside her door, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable, but clearly he had no intention of leaving. Blakely halted for a second. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, Dylan Ashford didn't look like the cold, untouchable CEO she had seen at the press conference. He looked like a man who had lost a game, but instead of walking away, he had decided to wait for his opponent to return for another round. She approached slowly, pulling off her gloves, her voice laced with curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Dylan glanced up at her, his gaze steady, yet tinged with something almost incredulous. "You left." Blakely chuckled softly, fishing for her keys in her purse, her tone teasing. "So you waited 2 hours just to tell me that?" Dylan folded his arms, tilting his head slightly as if assessing her reaction. "I want an explanation." "An explanation for what?" She unlocked the door but didn't step inside yet. Instead, she turned to face him. "That I'm not the kind of woman who wakes up, wears your shirt, and makes you breakfast?" Dylan leaned against the doorframe, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Exactly, because usually I'm the one who does that." Blakely laughed. She hadn't expected that response. She had thought he would be angry, or at least show a bit of the arrogance that powerful men often carried. But no, Dylan Ashford was standing outside her door, in the cold, not demanding, not accusing, just wanting to understand why she had walked away. She looked at him for a long moment before tilting her head, her voice still playfully mocking. "So, is it just your ego that can't handle the fact that I left first?" Dylan didn't say anything, just held her gaze with those piercing gray-blue eyes, searching for something in hers. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he sighed, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe himself. "Maybe." Blakely blinked at him. This man, who was always in control of everything, now standing outside her home for 2 hours in the freezing cold, over a drunken night. She leaned against the doorframe, squinting at him as if debating something. Should she let him in? She wasn't in the habit of inviting men into her home late at night, especially not Dylan Ashford, a billionaire CEO who had just waited 2 hours in the cold for her. But the way he stood there, not frustrated, not demanding, just wanting a simple answer, was admittedly intriguing. Slowly, she pushed the door open wider, folding her arms. "If you've been standing out here for 2 hours, you're probably cold. Come in." Dylan studied her for a moment, then stepped inside as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The door clicked shut behind them. Blakely took off her coat, hung it up, then walked into the kitchen. She didn't rush to talk. Instead, she calmly poured 2 cups of hot tea. When she handed him one, she raised an eyebrow. "No alcohol. I'm not repeating last night." Dylan took the cup, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Who said I wanted to?" Blakely locked eyes with him, her own lips curving slightly. "You did." Dylan let out a rare laugh. She always knew how to surprise him. She sat down at the table, cradling her tea in her hands, her tone light but sharp. "So what do you want now? A deep discussion about how men don't like being left behind? Or do you just want to know if I regret it?" Dylan pulled out a chair sitting across from her, placing his cup down. He tilted his head, his voice low, steady, yet full of intent. "Both." Blakely smiled faintly. "I don't regret it." She took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving his. "But I have no intention of making this a habit." Dylan rested his elbow on the table, watching her intently. "Why not?" She raised an eyebrow. Are you seriously asking me that? Dylan shrugged, unfazed. If you think last night was a one-time thing, then you're wrong. Blakely was silent for a moment. Then she let out a laugh. Confident, aren't you? Not confidence. Dylan shook his head slowly, his gaze deep and unwavering. Certainty, and I'd bet on it. The air shifted between them. Blakely studied him, and in that moment, she knew one thing. She was going to play this game with him, and who would win or lose? Well, that was yet to be decided. Since that night, Dylan Ashford refused to let Blakely Street Claire slip away. But he wasn't the type of man to send flowers every day or bombard her with messages. No, Dylan preferred a more strategic game. He appeared in places she frequented, not obtrusively, not excessively, but just enough to make sure she noticed. The first time, the cafe. The next morning, Blakely was at her usual cafe, typing away on her laptop, completely focused on her article. That was until a deep voice spoke right beside her. What are you writing today? She looked up, and of course, it was Dylan Ashford. She blinked. What are you doing here? Dylan unfastened a button on his coat, settling into the chair across from her with ease. Having coffee. There are hundreds of cafes in London. What a coincidence, huh? Dylan smirked. Maybe it's fate. Blakely chuckled, shaking her head. I don't believe in fate, but I do believe in the stalking abilities of a CEO with too much free time. Dylan took a sip of his coffee, unfazed. Dinner tonight? Blakely leaned back in her chair, pretending to consider it. I have plans, lying on my sofa and reading a book on male psychology. Perfect. I can help you with hands-on research. Sorry, but I prefer reading. Dylan's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with challenge. That's fine, but I don't take rejection lightly. The second time. The newsroom. The next day, Blakely had just stepped into the newsroom when a colleague rushed over, eyes wide with excitement. Blakely, there's a man waiting for you at reception. Super handsome, the successful businessman type. Definitely an ex? Blakely frowned. I don't have any exes that fit that description. She walked to the front desk, and naturally it was Dylan. Dressed in a sharp black suit, standing with effortless confidence, he didn't look like a man who had been turned down the night before. What are you doing here? She asked, arms crossed, eyebrow raised. Just wanted to take you to lunch. I have plans. Dylan tilted his head. Oh, with who? None of your business. Dylan chuckled, nodding as if conceding. I'm in no rush. I'll wait. And wait he did. By the time she finished work and stepped out of the office, he was still there, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, looking completely unbothered by the hours that had passed. Do you seriously have nothing better to do? She asked, exasperation creeping into her voice. I have plenty to do. He stepped closer, his eyes dancing with amusement. But one thing is more important, getting you to say yes. Blakely studied him for a long moment, then exhaled, folding her arms. Fine, one dinner, but I choose the place. Dylan pretended to consider, as long as it's not a fast food joint. Too bad. I was planning on taking you for burgers. Dylan laughed, shaking his head. I don't mind, as long as you're sitting across from me. The third time, the charity gala. That evening, Blakely attended a prestigious charity gala. Dressed in a sophisticated navy blue gown, she had just taken a sip of champagne when a familiar deep voice murmured beside her. You're late. She nearly choked on her drink. Turning, she found Dylan in a black tuxedo, standing there with that signature smug smirk. Why are you here? Dylan lifted his glass, his eyes gleaming with mischief. I'm the main sponsor of this event, and of course I had to continue the game. Blakely let out a soft laugh. This game was far from over. The charity auction, a game of wits. The charity auction took place in a lavish ballroom, glowing under the light of crystal chandeliers. London's elite filled the space, distinguished gentlemen, successful entrepreneurs, and renowned figures from the art world, exchanging polite handshakes and elegantly raising their champagne glasses. Blakely, draped in a deep crimson evening gown, moved through the crowd with her signature confidence. She was never one to shy away from power. On the contrary, she relished observing them, sometimes teasing them with sharp, cutting remarks. She had just taken a sip of champagne, prepared to enjoy a quiet evening, when a familiar, deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "We meet again!" Blakely exhaled and turned her head, and just as she expected, Dylan Ashford. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, he stood beside her, that signature half-smirk tugging at his lips, his eyes glinting with a quiet challenge. "You seem to have a habit of showing up wherever I am." Dylan shrugged, mischief flickering in his gaze. "Must be fate." Blakely chuckled. "That line again? You need some new material." Dylan didn't reply. Instead, he took a champagne flute from a passing waiter and gestured toward the stage, where the auction was in full swing. "Are you planning to bid?" "Depends. Is there anything worth bidding on?" The auction continued, luxurious items fetching staggering bids. A painting by a renowned artist, a dazzling diamond jewelry set, a private wine-tasting evening with a Michelin star chef. Blakely remained largely uninterested, until the auctioneer excitedly announced the next item. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, we present a truly special prize, an exclusive luxury trip to Italy, 5-star accommodations, Michelin dining, and private jet travel." A murmur rippled through the room. This was undoubtedly one of the most coveted offerings of the evening. "Bidding starts at £50,000. Blakely arched an eyebrow, watching as a few wealthy contenders raised their paddles. "Arubadayiram, Yerubatayiram, Tonurayiram." Then a voice, deep, composed, and utterly confident, cut through the air. 150,000. Blakely's head snapped to the side. Dylan had casually set his champagne down, raising his paddle without hesitation. The room fell silent for a few beats. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily stunned before regaining composure and calling out, £50,000. Do we have a higher bid?" Silence. No one dared challenge the number. "Going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Dylan Ashford." Applause filled the room. Dylan leaned back in his chair, smirking as he glanced at Blakely. "You didn't have to go to such lengths just to impress me." Dylan arched a brow. "Who said I bought it for you?" Blakely scoffed, unimpressed. "Then I suppose I'll wait to see who your lucky companion is." "Of course." She was about to walk away when the auctioneer spoke up again. "And as per tradition, the winner must now announce who they'll be taking on this luxurious getaway." The room hushed, waiting. Dylan turned to Blakely, amusement and challenge flickering in his gaze. "Miss St. Clair, do you like Italy?" She stared at him. "Are you trying to bribe me with a lavish vacation?" Dylan took a slow sip of his champagne, then leaned in slightly, his voice low and teasing. "I'm just curious to see if you can resist Italy." Blakely chuckled softly, but she didn't answer right away. She did love Italy. More importantly, she loved the game, and she would play it to the very end. Florence, a game of unexpected choices. Dylan Ashford's private jet touched down at Florence Airport on a breathtaking autumn afternoon. From above, Blakely could see the terracotta rooftops, the ancient cobblestone streets, and the Arno River winding like a silk ribbon through the heart of the city. She had traveled to many places in the world, but there was no denying that Florence had a charm of its own. Yet the strangest part of this trip wasn't the city, it was the man sitting across from her. Dylan Ashford, arms crossed, leaning back against the plush leather seat, he casually took a sip of fine Italian wine, his blue eyes flickering with something between amusement and curiosity as he watched her. "Are you ready to admit this trip is going to be unforgettable?" he asked, his tone carrying the slightest hint of self-satisfaction. Blakely scoffed, tilting her head. "I'll decide after I see if the hotel serves breakfast in bed." Dylan chuckled. "Trust me, the service at this hotel won't disappoint you." The words were simple, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Blakely realize this trip wouldn't just be a vacation. Venice, a confession by the canal. The next day they arrived in Venice. The crisp air of the canal city made everything feel impossibly romantic. What she hadn't expected was for Dylan to have arranged a private gondola ride. Blakely never thought she'd find herself on a traditional Venetian boat with a man like him. A man who thrived on control, always calculating his next move. And yet here they were. A gentle breeze tousled her hair, and as she reached up to tuck a strand behind her ear, Dylan was faster. He carefully brushed the loose strands away, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary. His gaze was so focused, so intense, that Blakely felt her heartbeat stutter for a moment. I always thought CEOs like you only traveled on luxury yachts. Occasionally, I enjoy tradition. His smirk was unmistakable. They glided past the Rialto Bridge, a place steeped in legends, rumored to bless those who kissed beneath it at sunset with a love that would last forever. Do you believe in legends? Dylan asked suddenly, his voice deep and measured. Blakely arched an eyebrow. Which one? The one that says if two people kiss under this bridge at sunset, they'll stay together forever. She let out a soft laugh. Are you planning to test it? Dylan didn't answer. He just looked at her, his gaze unreadable. Then, without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing lightly against the corner of hers. Blakely froze. It wasn't a demanding kiss, just the softest touch, but it sent a slow-burning fire coursing through her veins, making her breath catch. She inhaled sharply, her heart pounding harder than she cared to admit. Do you believe now? Dylan murmured, his voice smooth as velvet. Blakely swallowed, forcing herself to stay composed. I don't believe in legends, but I do believe in Italian wine and pizza. Dylan chuckled, but this time his eyes held something deeper, something more than just amusement. Tuscany, an afternoon to remember. The next day they wandered through the endless vineyards of Tuscany. The air here was different from Venice, peaceful, timeless, with an almost fairy tale-like quality. They sampled exquisite wines, and Dylan stood just a little closer than usual. Every time she glanced sideways, his gaze was already on her, studying every shift in her expression. As they walked past a particularly tall vine, Blakely suddenly rose on her toes, reaching for a cluster of ripe purple grapes. Before she could grab them, a strong hand moved ahead of hers, plucking them first. Dylan turned to her, holding the fruit out. Do you always have to win? She teased. Dylan shrugged. I don't compete. I just know what I want. She took the grapes from him, slowly popping one into her mouth. As she bit down, a droplet of sweet juice trickled down the corner of her lips. Before she could wipe it away, Dylan reached out, his thumb brushing the stray drop from her skin. The world seemed to still. Blakely felt her breath falter. You know, Dylan murmured, I've never met anyone like you. She smiled, attempting to mask the strange unease curling inside her. Really? I thought you'd met every type of woman there is. None like you. For the first time in a long while, Blakely's heart skipped a beat. Amalfi when there was no turning back. On their last night in Italy, they arrived in Amalfi, where towering cliffs embrace small, picturesque villages painted in vivid hues. After dinner, just as Blakely was about to retreat to her room, Dylan suddenly reached for her hand. She turned to him, waiting. Dylan stepped closer, his teasing demeanor gone, replaced by something raw, something serious. I thought this was just a game, he murmured. Blakely's heartbeat stuttered. But I was wrong, Dylan continued, his voice rough, edged with something unfamiliar. I don't want this to be just another trip, and I don't want you to disappear on me again. Her fingers curled into her palm. Dylan tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. I'm not joking, he said softly, but there was no mistaking the certainty in his voice. Blakely swallowed hard. She knew Dylan wasn't the kind of man who let his guard down easily. What do you want from me? Dylan didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned down and kissed her. It was no longer a game, no longer a wager or a challenge. This kiss held something far deeper, a declaration, a silent answer. And in that moment, Blakely knew. She had fallen, and there was no turning back. The Ashford estate, when reality strikes. They were officially a couple now, but Blakely knew that sooner or later they would have to face reality. And reality had a name. Eleanor Ashford, Dylan's mother, a woman of impeccable elegance, formidable power, and standards so high they were nearly unattainable. Their first meeting took place at the Ashford estate, an imposing mansion standing on vast, pristine land in the outskirts of London. Blakely stepped into the grand sitting room, where large family portraits adorned the walls, and soft lighting reflected off the luxurious, velvet-upholstered sofas. She was rarely nervous, but even she had to admit, this felt suspiciously like an interrogation. Eleanor Ashford sat gracefully in a Victorian armchair, a delicate teacup in hand, her sharp eyes studying Blakely with clinical precision. "Miss St. Clair, I've heard quite a bit about you." Her voice was smooth yet laced with an underlying sharpness. Blakely smiled. "I hope it was all good things." Eleanor set down her cup, tilting her head ever so slightly. "A bold, outspoken journalist like yourself? I highly doubt that everything I've heard has been positive." Blakely arched an eyebrow, unfazed. "Honesty is a virtue, Mrs. Ashford." Eleanor pursed her lips and turned her gaze to Dylan, who stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the conversation unfold like a chess match. "Son, how exactly did you end up choosing a journalist with such a sharp tongue?" Eleanor's voice was calm, but the undertone was clear. She didn't approve. Blakely opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Dylan spoke first. He stepped forward, his stance relaxed yet assertive, the perfectly tailored suit only adding to his quiet confidence. "Mother, if she didn't make my life more interesting, do you really think I'd ever settle for something dull?" Blakely blinked. For a moment she had been considering how to navigate this delicate conversation, but here Dylan was, casually defending her like it was the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor remained silent for a few beats before sighing and setting her teacup down. "Dylan, you've always been stubborn." There was a hint of exasperation in her voice. "But remember, love is one thing, suitability is another." Dylan didn't flinch. "Mother, you're speaking as if I'm not intelligent enough to know what I want." Eleanor shook her head. "My dear, intelligence does not always equate to the right decision." The air in the room grew tense. Blakely could sense Eleanor's disapproval, but if she thought Blakely would back down that easily, she was dead wrong. Blakely leaned forward, resting an elbow on the armrest, her lips curling slightly. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand you only want the best for your son, but may I ask you something?" Eleanor raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Go ahead." Blakely tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Do you believe that a woman who meets your standards of perfection could actually make Dylan happy?" Eleanor blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Blakely continued, her voice even but firm. "Dylan isn't the kind of man who thrives in monotony. If he wanted someone simply to sit beside him at high society events, we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we?" Dylan smirked, clearly enjoying this. Eleanor remained silent for a moment, her gaze unreadable. Then finally she stood and turned to Dylan. "You've made up your mind, haven't you?" Dylan nodded without hesitation. "I have." Eleanor sighed. "Then don't disappoint me." And with that, she left the room, leaving behind an unsettling silence. Blakely leaned back, taking a sip of tea. "I don't think she likes me very much." Dylan chuckled. "Trust me, if she truly hated you, she wouldn't have been nearly this polite." Blakely eyed him skeptically. "You sure about that?" Dylan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low murmur near her ear. "I'm sure about a lot of things, and one of them is this. I've never been more sure about anyone the way I am about you." Blakely blinked. Damn, she thought she had won this round. But no, she had just fallen deeper into this game. When the world started watching, it wasn't just Dylan's family. All of London's high society and the media couldn't sit still in the face of the unexpected relationship between the cold-hearted CEO and the sharp-tongued journalist. That morning, as Blakely walked into the newsroom with a cappuccino in hand, all eyes turned to her. There was even a low whistle from a nearby desk. "Well, well, our queen of journalism is now the muse of the billionaire elite," a voice rang out, dripping with amusement. Blakely set her coffee down, leaning against her desk, arms crossed, arching an eyebrow at Matt, a sharp-witted political journalist who thrived on gossip. If I'm a muse, I'd be the kind that stirs up storms. She smirked. Linda, her colleague and closest friend, cut in, her voice serious. Blakely, are you sure this is worth the risk? Dylan Ashford isn't exactly known for commitment. He's famous for relationships that burn fast and disappear even faster. In the financial world, they call him ruthless. And the media? They call him the handsome bastard. Blakely interrupted with a small smile. I know, Linda. I'm a journalist, remember? Matt folded his arms, tilting his head. So tell me, what is this? A game? Or do you actually think he can change? Blakely took a slow sip of her coffee. She hated explaining herself, even more so when people tried to analyze her like some psychological experiment. But she still answered, her tone composed. If he's playing a game, then I'll be the opponent who doesn't play fair. And don't forget, in my game, the winner is always the one with grace and intelligence. The newsroom fell silent for a beat. Then Matt let out a laugh. God, I love how you convince yourself, Blakely. Linda, however, sighed. I just don't want you to get hurt. You know that, right? Blakely met her friend's worried gaze. She understood Linda's concern, but at the same time, she knew herself. She wasn't the kind of woman who got swept up in romance and forgot who she was. She squeezed Linda's hand gently. Trust me, if anyone should be worried, it's Dylan. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, London's high society was buzzing. Did you hear? Dylan Ashford is dating a journalist. A journalist, not a socialite, not an actress, someone whose pen could take down an entire empire. Dylan, the ruthless strategist of the finance world, caught up in a love affair? It's absurd. Blakely is famous for her razor-sharp wit, but paired with Dylan? Could this be the perfect blend of fire and ice? Every whisper, every speculation painted a picture everyone wanted to see. A battle between a man who refused to be controlled and a woman who refused to bow to anyone. And Dylan knew it. I feel like I've become a hot topic without even needing a press conference, he muttered as he scrolled through a tabloid headline about their relationship. Blakely glanced at him, smirking. Welcome to my world. Dylan leaned back, his gaze playful. Your world is interesting. You still have time to back out, Dylan, she teased. Dylan let out a low chuckle, stepping closer, placing one hand on the back of her chair, leaning down just enough to make her pulse flicker. Do I seem like the kind of man who backs down? Blakely blinked. Damn it, she hated how effortless he made this look. No, she said, keeping her voice steady. I think you're the kind of man who enjoys a challenge. But the problem is, she placed a hand on his chest, gently pushing him back, just enough to create a sliver of space between them. I'm not a prize to be won. I'm an opponent worth fighting. Dylan smiled, slow, deliberate. I wouldn't want it any other way. And with that, the game continued, through endless whispers, through disapproving glances, yet not once did either of them retreat. Because this wasn't just a game of power or passion. This was them, playing the game together. London nights in a final move. The London evening was crisp, but inside their favorite upscale cafe, the air was warm, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional clinking of porcelain cups. As always, Blakely sat across from Dylan, one hand wrapped around a steaming cappuccino, the other idly twirling a silver spoon as she recounted a hilarious tale about the subtle power struggle between the high society wives at last week's charity gala. Dylan watched her in silence. She had been the most unexpected part of his life, the woman who challenged him, saw through him, and never let him win too easily. How long had it been? 6 months? A year? Time blurred when he was with her. At first, Dylan thought Blakely was just an entertaining challenge. But at some point, he realized his world had started revolving around her. He no longer wanted to play games. He wanted forever. Dylan set his wine glass down, leaning forward slightly, his gaze soft yet resolute. Blakely, do you remember our argument about who's the better strategist? Blakely looked up, raising a playful eyebrow. Oh, of course. I told you that if you could wait outside my door for 2 hours, it would prove your feelings weren't just a game. Dylan chuckled. Exactly. And tonight, I want to tell you, I don't just want to play for a night. I want a lifetime of this, of us, of all the unexpected turns, of all the arguments over my poorly knotted ties. Blakely laughed. Dylan Ashford, London's cold, ruthless CEO, now sitting across from her, talking about arguing over ties? Before she could respond, Dylan stood. He walked over to a corner of the cafe, reached into the barista's drawer, something clearly prearranged, then turned back toward her, holding a small, exquisitely crafted box. And then he knelt. The cafe fell completely silent. Blakely's eyes widened. I know you're brilliant, fearless, and impossible to tame, Dylan began, his voice steady but full of something raw. And that's exactly why I want to stand beside you, to laugh with you, to win with you, to face every battle together. Will you let me prove that, while I once was a CEO who hated commitment, now I am ready for a lifetime of not just unpredictable dates, but of shared dreams and futures? She stared at him. Dylan Ashford was proposing, not with an elaborate speech or some extravagant grand gesture, but as himself, honest, unwavering, and with just the right touch of humor. For the first time in a long time, Blakely was speechless. Dylan watched her, a flicker of nervousness in his otherwise confident demeanor. You're not thinking of running, are you? He blurted, making the entire cafe burst into laughter. Blakely snapped out of it, then laughed too. Dylan, you know, I used to think that everything between us was just a game. But then, every time you waited for me, rain or shine, I realized something different. She reached out, gently touching his face. I say yes. Applause erupted around them. Even the cafe staff and strangers smiled, caught up in the moment. Dylan slid the ring onto her finger. Good, because I've already planned the honeymoon. Blakely squinted. You're already thinking about the honeymoon? Of course, this time I'm not letting you walk away first. She laughed, loud, free, and completely unguarded, before pulling him up and pressing a kiss to his lips amid the cheering crowd. And just like that, the game was over. Not with a winner or a loser, but with the best ending imaginable. London's most unpredictable wedding. All of London was buzzing with anticipation for the wedding of the year. The union of Dylan Ashford, the cold, ruthless CEO, and Blakely St. Clair, the sharp-tongued, fearless journalist whose words could expose the truth like no other. But for those expecting a stiff, traditional high society affair, they were about to be proven very, very wrong. Their wedding took place at a grand, centuries-old castle on the outskirts of London, where every detail reflected their essence. From the witty invitation cards that read, "Come witness a battle of wits that will never end," to the bold decor featuring some of the most memorable and savage quotes they had thrown at each other over the course of their relationship. Blakely walked down the aisle in a gown that was both elegant and unapologetically her, the sheer veil embroidered with humorous excerpts from her most famous articles. Dylan, always the man of impeccable style, wore a custom black suit with a subtle yet iconic detail. The lining of his jacket was stitched with the words, "I stood outside your door for 2 hours." There were no painfully long speeches. Instead, friends and family roared with laughter as the MC recounted some of their most ridiculous moments. We all know Dylan Ashford is a brilliant strategist, but his most ambitious plan was completely wrecked by a woman and a drunken night. Blakely chuckled, glancing at her soon-to-be husband, while Dylan simply shook his head in feigned exasperation. When it was his turn to speak, he raised his glass, eyes locked on hers, soft, steady, utterly devoted. Blakely, you are the only woman who has ever dared to leave me after a night together, and the only one who makes me want to be left behind forever. Laughter rang through the hall, but there were also tears. All the doubts, the opposition, whether from Dylan's mother, Blakely's colleagues, or the whispers of London's elite, had faded into irrelevance. Because in this moment, no one could deny one thing: their love was real. 1 year later, chaos and perfection. If anyone thought marriage would slow them down, they were terribly mistaken. Dylan and Blakely's life became even more unpredictable. filled with passionate debates over everything from business strategies to the correct type of bread for breakfast. But there was one major change. They weren't just a duo anymore. They were a family, and not just with one child, but two. Meet Ethan and Evie, the Ashford twins. Intelligent, mischievous, the perfect mix of their parents. They had Blakely's sharp wit and Dylan's piercing stare, a terrifyingly effective combination. Even as toddlers, their personalities were clear. Ethan was calm and calculated, watching the world like a future CEO in the making. Evie, on the other hand, she was a miniature Blakely, always ready with a cutting remark at just the right moment. Dylan, a man who had built an empire, faced ruthless business adversaries and controlled billion-dollar deals, was completely powerless against them. One memorable incident? Blakely was attending a press conference when suddenly Evie climbed onto the podium and with a perfectly innocent face yelled, "Mummy, can I tell the reporters that Daddy burned the toast last night?" The entire hall erupted into laughter. Dylan, who was watching from the side, coughed, adjusted his tie, and tried to maintain his usual CEO composure. But there was no escaping this. The best question ever asked. One evening, Ethan climbed into bed between his parents, looking unusually serious. "Mummy, Daddy," he said, eyes filled with curiosity, "I saw your wedding pictures. But why does Mummy look so happy, and Daddy looks at Mummy like she's a treasure?" Blakely grinned, turning to Dylan with an amused look. "Because your father knows that without me, life would be terribly boring." Dylan pulled his son into his arms, his voice soft yet certain. "No, son, it's because I know that without your mother, I'd never have won this game." The game never ended, but love always won. For Dylan and Blakely, marriage was never about winning or losing. It was an adventure, filled with unpredictability, laughter, and unconditional love. And in this game, neither of them won, because they had already found the greatest prize of all, each other. Thank you for following our story. Did this story touch your heart? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel.